The Peloponnesian War was the setting of Thucydides' history, and the war that tore the Hellenistic world in two. On one side, the old power of Sparta and the Peloponnesian League. On the other, Athens and the Delian League. Sparta's military power was unmatched on land. Meanwhile, Athens' navy ruled the sea. This war would see the Greek world engaged in a bloody struggle from 431 to 404 BCE, and result in the dissolution of Athens' empire, Spartan hegemony over the Greeks, and the reintroduction of Persian influence in the region. I'm your host, Joseph Deagan, and today our show places you in the middle of the conflict still studied to understand great power relations. Our subject, a failed Athenian campaign known as the Sicilian Expedition, often attributed as one of the leading causes of Athens' eventual defeat in the war. In 421 BCE, Athens found itself in a precarious position. The Peace of Nicias, named for the Athenian general who helped bring the peace into being, brought an end to the conflict after 10 years of warfare. Many hoped the peace would stabilize Greece and allow Sparta and Athens to once again act as allies, as they had during the Persian invasion 70 years prior. However, the peace was threatened by enemies all around. From without, many of the Spartan allies, namely Corinth and Thebes, were vehemently against the fragile peace that was established between Athens and Sparta, and refused to enforce the terms of the treaty. From within, many young Athenians still hungered for conflict. This hawkish faction was headed by Alcibiades. This charismatic playboy was the ward of Pericles and a student of Socrates, though he lacked the patriotism of the former and the ethics of the latter. Instead, he was a populist who was willing to cross any line for personal glory. Freshly turned 30, Alcibiades had finally reached the age where he could become a general when the Peace of Nicias sabotaged his opportunity. He had spent the last 6 years of the peace attempting to goad the two sides into conflict. Finally, in 415, a golden egg was laid in his lap when envoys from Segesta, a long-standing Athenian ally from the island of Sicily, came seeking aid. They offered money to pay for 60 ships to aid them in their conflict with Selinus, an ally of Syracuse. Syracuse was the main regional power in Sicily. Though a fellow democracy, Syracuse made an enemy of Athens after displacing the Leontini, another Athenian ally. The plea from Segesta presented an opportunity for Athens to seek revenge. Skeptical at first, the Athenians sent ambassadors to Segesta to confirm the envoys' claims. Upon their return, the Athenians spoke of great riches, which caused the Athenian assembly, which already felt honor-bound to help their allies, to enthusiastically agree to the plan. They approached Nicias, Alcibiades, and Lamachus as generals to lead the expedition, tasked with aiding the Segestans against the Seleucids, restoring Leontini, and generally doing what was best for Athens' interests. Fearful of the possibility of such a mission endangering his peace, or the stability of Athens, Nicias spoke out in attempts to change the assembly's mind. He argued that the information presented to the assembly was unreliable, and that Athens was in the middle of an unstable peace, with wolves at the door and rebels within its empire. Sicily was too large and too far to be ruled effectively, and it was, quote, folly to go against men who could not be kept under, even if conquered. In response, Alcibiades reminded the assembly that it would be a stain on Athens' honor to not aid an ally. Furthermore, the expedition would allow Athens to humble Sparta and rule or ruin Syracuse. Alcibiades believed Athens should not halt its growth, and instead must scheme to extend it, for if we cease to rule others, we are in danger of being ruled by others. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? Athens ruled the sea, and could thus come and go as they pleased. In a final attempt to at least remove himself from the expedition, Nicias spoke once more of how many resources a successful expedition would require. He argued that unless the assembly was willing to provide large sums of money and manpower, he should be removed from the expedition. His efforts were for naught. The assembly accepted Nicias' proposal. The expedition would leave with a total of 134 galleys, 5,100 hoplites, 480 archers, 700 slingers, 120 light infantry, and 30 horses. The largest expedition Athens had ever fielded, and reminiscent of the Trojan Wars. News of the expedition brought Athens to life. Blacksmiths worked their forges, while captains readied their ships for the long journey. The amount of wealth poured into material was extravagant, with ships attempting to outdo one another in grandeur. But days before the expedition was set to leave, disaster struck. Some troublemakers had defaced the Hermes throughout Athens. These were the idols of the god Hermes, the messenger god, and of safe passage, and defacing his image was seen as an ill omen for the expedition. Hunting for a culprit, the assembly decided that Alcibiades was likely at fault due to his sacrilegious tendencies. After all, he had mockingly performed secret religious rituals in the past, the logic of a man sabotaging his own expedition notwithstanding. Alcibiades knew that delaying the verdict would only allow his political enemies to dredge up more false charges and push for an immediate trial. However, the assembly denied his request out of fear that Alcibiades' influence and the amassing army under his command would prevent justice. The Sicilian expedition would depart as planned, with Alcibiades, the accused traitor, as one of its leaders. The Athenian fleet set sail from Piraeus to meet with a forward contingent at the island of Corcyra before sailing across the Ionian Sea, around the boot of Italy, to Sicily. Immediately, trouble reared its ugly head. The fleet was too large for any Italian harbors and had to be split into 3 smaller, more vulnerable groups for the crossing. Nevertheless, these sizable fleets were still too intimidating for cities to offer more than a beach to land on and water to drink, if the Athenians weren't banned outright. Even old Athenian allies in the region refused to offer more than token support. Upon reaching Sicily, the fleets regrouped, but more disaster struck. The suggestions had fooled the Athenian envoys as to how much money was available, and only a token amount could be gathered. After such a rocky start, the generals had a decision to make. Alcibiades argued that the expedition was still possible if only Athens spent time raiding Syracuse and gathering support from Sicilian cities that resented Syracuse's power before starting the siege in earnest. Nicias thought the suggested trickery warranted only the original 60 planned ships staying, while the remainder of the Athenian fleet could sail around Sicily as a show of power before returning home. Lamachus believed striking Syracuse immediately was the best plan, but relented to Alcibiades to break the stalemate. When the expedition first sailed to Syracuse, they found the terrain intimidating. Syracuse sat on an outcropping of land that connected the city to an island. To the north and south were 2 harbors, with the southern harbor being magnitudes larger than Athens. To top it off, Syracuse needed only a short wall to protect the city due to its narrow connection to the land. Said wall was overlooked by the Epiolae, a high ground outside the city that would have to be taken to place the city under siege. Afterward, the Athenians ported in Catana, an allied city north of Syracuse, and began by pursuing Alcibiades' raiding strategy, but with only limited success. It was upon his return from one of these raids that Alcibiades was recalled to Athens for trial, the charges only growing in his absence. Fearing death, Alcibiades escaped when the ships landed in Italy for harbor. He sought asylum in Sparta, where he betrayed the Athenians by encouraging Sparta to defend Syracuse. He spun tales saying the Athenians planned on controlling the whole Greek world, and that Sicily was only the beginning. Sparta moved to intervene. With Alcibiades gone, Lamachus launched an assault of the city after luring the Syracusan army to march on Catana. Upon discovering the ruse, the Syracusan army returned to give battle to the Athenians, but was poorly positioned and defeated. Only the superior number of Syracusan cavalry prevented a complete rout and avoided a decisive Athenian victory. Then, the Athenian expedition returned to winter in Catana, where they received cavalry reinforcements. The next summer, Athens seized the initiative again by stealthily approaching and taking the Epiolae before the 500-strong Syracusan contingent ordered to hold it could stop them. This group was quickly beaten off, allowing the Athenians to begin constructing siege walls to cut off the city by land. Syracuse then attempted to build their own counterwalls to prevent Athens from completing their walls to the sea. The subsequent skirmishes saw losses on both sides. The Athenians successfully reached the Great Harbor with their walls, but Lamachus was killed in the fighting. Nicias then continued the siege in Lamachus' stead, completing the southern walls into the Great Harbor and a northern wall that would complete the encirclement. Before the northern wall could be completed, however, disaster struck. Reinforcements from Sparta, under the command of Gylippus, arrived and began contesting the building of the northern wall by building their own counterwall. This time, under Spartan leadership, the Syracusans would be victorious, successfully defeating the Athenian attempt at destroying the counter wall through a superior number of skirmishers, and cavalry defeating the Athenian left flank. Syracuse would not be encircled by land. Predicting these difficulties upon the Spartan arrival, Nicias saw fit to reposition his navy to a more strategic position, building 3 forts on the Peloponnesian, from which the Athenian navy could blockade the city by sea. It was here that the siege reached a standstill. Both sides called for further reinforcements, with Nicias outright requesting the expedition to be recalled unless Athens sent a more sizable force. Instead, Athens sent a force that effectively doubled the size of the expedition, under the leadership of Demosthenes and MIDN. Before reinforcements could arrive, the Athenian position further deteriorated when Gylippus seized the Athenian forts on the Peloponnesian through a land assault while the Athenian navy was engaged at sea. The Athenian navy won the naval engagement, despite being outnumbered 60 ships to 80, by taking advantage of the lack of discipline of the Syracuse captains to disrupt their formation. However, upon discovering their forts were taken, the Athenian ships were forced to camp with the remainder of the army. Upon arrival, Demosthenes led one last attempt at accomplishing an envelopment by striking the northern counterwall at night, the only night battle of the entire war. Despite early success, the confusion of the Athenian force in the darkness led to failure. Here, Demosthenes and MIDN both wanted to leave, but Nicias held out, wanting to save face in front of the assembly, and hoping that reports that Syracuse was almost bankrupt and ready to sue for peace were true. Yet waiting only led to the arrival of more Syracusan reinforcements. Finally, giving up hope, the Athenians planned to leave under the light of a full moon. Just as the ships were preparing to sneak out of the harbor, a lunar eclipse proved a poor omen. The superstitious sailors refused to sail. Nicias, devoutly religious, sought the counsel of his diviners. They suggested that it would be unsafe to sail until the next full moon. The expedition was delayed by a month. This added time allowed the Syracusan navy to build a seawall out of ships, ropes, and chains that prevented any ships from sailing in and out of the harbor. The Athenians were well and truly trapped. Demosthenes attempted to sally forth with every ship the Athenians could still muster, but they failed to break through the wall and escape by sea, with Demosthenes dying during the fighting. Nicias and MIDN then attempted to escape by land with the remainder of the army, leaving the wounded to die, but fell into a Syracusan ambush and were completely defeated. Though Gylippus wanted to bring the 2 captured generals back to Sparta, the Syracusans butchered them both. Meanwhile, the remainder of the army became slaves, forced to work in the quarry, where most would die in the following months. The defeat of the Athenians was so complete that not a single messenger escaped. The city failed to receive word of the expedition's fate until tales of traveling merchants were brought before a doubtful, then shocked assembly. That over 40,000 Athenians could be killed or captured was nigh unthinkable. Thucydides concludes Book 7 and his recounting of the expedition by labeling it the greatest Hellenic achievement of any in this war, or, in my opinion, in Hellenic history, at once the most glorious to the victors and most calamitous to the conquered. So what was the root cause of this now Sicilian disaster? Was Nicias to blame? He was the general in charge of most of the expedition, and under his leadership saw stagnation and a decline in the Athenian position. Or maybe this was Alcibiades' fault. After all, he was the expedition's most ardent supporter. His strategy failed to gather more allies, and his defection helped sway Sparta's support. Historians disagree on the subject. Thucydides looked upon Nicias favorably, calling him a man who, of all the Hellenes in my time, least deserved such a fate, seeing that the whole course of his life had been regulated with strict attention to virtue. Despite not blaming any one person or thing in particular, Thucydides does not vilify Nicias. The same cannot be said of the later historians, John Hale and Peter Green, who heavily criticized Nicias' indecision as a central cause. Green in particular cites the Athenians' lack of cavalry as an issue that left them immobile on land and prevented them from striking a decisive land victory. Perhaps most culpable of all was the Athenian assembly, who first agreed to the expedition, which accepted any ideas that broadened its size and scope. The assembly that sent the expedition's most ardent supporter away, only to recall him for heresy, leaving him no choice but to flee for Spartan protection, and the assembly, who doubled down after Nicias requested a reprieve. If the expedition was doomed from the start, as it appears, then it was the citizens at home that supported the venture who were to blame for pursuing folly out of hubris. Despite the debates, One fact is uncontested. The Sicilian expedition's failure seemed to leave Athens with nothing. Its great fleet was in ruins. Alcibiades, the most ardent supporter of the expedition, had turned traitor, while Athens' other leaders were either slain in battle or executed. Much of Athens' rebuilt wealth from the peace left with the expedition. Most importantly, Alcibiades had finally accomplished his goal. The peace of Nicias lay in tatters. The Peloponnesian War was reignited, with Athens in a worse position than ever before. How it still managed to struggle for another 9 years is a tale for another time, full of new heroes and new battles. As for the Sicilian expedition, our story comes to an end. Much like Icarus, Athens' pride had allowed it to fly too close to the sun, adding to the adage that pride comes before a fall.